Welcome back for another Bitchspot Quickie. I'm Cephus, author of the Bitchspot blog and host of the Bitchspot Report podcast. You know, my blog's been around off and on since 2005, and in that time I've talked about a lot of topics. One that I identified very early on was the harm that is done by religion. I realized that I was reporting on some death, some torture, some crime done against another person in the name of religion almost on a weekly basis. It was then that I created the Religious Horror Show, a single category under which I could place all of these stories. My rules for the Religious Horror Show were simple. The story had to involve death or serious bodily, emotional, or psychological injury to another human being, and it had to be caused specifically by religion. It wouldn't include, for example, a Christian pastor who robbed a bank and killed 3 guards, but it could include the same story if the pastor told investigators that God had told him to do it. It had to demonstrate a causal link between irrational religious beliefs and demonstrable harm in the real world. This feature ran irregularly on my blog for several years, building to several hundred entries. Sometimes I couldn't find an appropriate story for weeks. Sometimes I'd write about it almost every day. It just depended on how the news stories fell. However, over time, I realized that I was becoming desensitized to the whole thing, that the stories were just stories, and I wasn't being as emotionally disturbed by them as I once had been. When something like that happens, it's time to take a break, and so I discontinued the feature and refused to write anything about these horror stories for the longest time. However, sometimes there are stories that just have to be told, and they started to creep back into my blogging lineup, and once again, I realized that they were filling an ever-increasing amount of space, so last fall I reintroduced the Religious Horror Show as a feature, placed it onto a specific day of the week, Sunday, which seems oddly appropriate, and dedicated myself to writing one story a week about the dangers of religious belief. Now don't get me wrong, it wasn't that I only had enough stories to tell once a week. I could do this every day, 365 days a year. I even have to be very selective about what stories I tell, or I'll be overwhelmed. As I'm recording this, I have stories written for the next 5 Sundays, and stories for the next 7 thereafter. There is no limit to the inhumanity that man can visit upon his fellow man in the name of religion. If these stories don't disturb you, then there's something wrong with you. Unfortunately, for so many religious adherents, they don't get particularly bothered by these stories, at least not enough to take action. Far too often, these cases are just blown off as some other sect's problem. The pedophile priest scandal? That's a Catholic problem, and I'm a Protestant. Crazy Muslim terrorist killing runners in Boston? So what? I'm a Buddhist. Buddhists killing Muslims in the street? Big deal. I'm a Scientologist. And yes, just saying that last one left a nasty taste in my mouth. People seem a bit more willing to recognize bad behavior when their chosen cult isn't responsible. In fact, people often revel in the horrors of other religions and use it as a means to proclaim their own religion to be the correct one. Of course, the second their own religion is responsible, well, they find some way to spin it so it's not really their faith at fault. No true Christians is in the same vein as the no true Scotsman fallacy. It's far, far too common. A real Christian or a real Muslim or a real Hindu would never do that. Of course, when it's someone else's religion, yes, those are the real Christians and the real Muslims and the real Hindus. People are hypocrites. They operate with broad strokes to either support or denounce a religion based on their own personal biases. They lack the ability to step back and examine the situation objectively. Far too often, these are stories about a faraway land where people can simply imagine that the guilty can't possibly hold the same beliefs that they do. But even when it is their problem, even when the horrors come from their own backyard, there are so many theists who refuse to acknowledge them. There is case after case after case where the parishioners of disgraced pastors, pedophile priests, molesting ministers, and raping rabbis, where their congregation comes out in support of their clergy, even after the clergyman has admitted his guilt or been found guilty in a court of law. There simply is no excuse for this kind of behavior. Now, I don't want to go into all the various specific cases of religious horror. Well, we'd be here through the end of the decade. Individual stories can be found quite easily, and as I said, I write a story of one every single week and archive all of my past stories at the Bitchspot blog. I encourage you to go take a look at some of the more recent stories. If you have one that I haven't covered, by all means, send me a link via email at bitchspot@jdragononline.com, and I'll try to get to it sooner or later. Instead, I think we need to take a look at some of the largest types of cases, and the biggest, without doubt, is the Catholic sex scandal. The Catholic Church has had pedophile and sex offender priests since time immemorial. Personally, I think a lot of it goes back to the refusal to allow priests to marry. Celibacy is just not a natural human state. Most people cannot do it over their entire lives. Sex is an essential human requirement, and if deprived of it, an individual will naturally seek out a means of quenching this most basic human thirst. In the case of priests, they've got pretty easy access to children, and children are in general quite easy to manipulate, much easier than adults. Children seek to please adults, especially adults that they've been told are in authority. This is especially problematic for adults who supposedly have God on their side. God will be very angry with you if you don't pull down your pants, Billy. You don't want God to be angry, do you? Yet, instead of solving the problems, or even ensuring the problem priests are prosecuted, the Catholic Church has hidden, transferred, and protected pedophile priests and has paid through the nose to victims. Between 1950 and 2012, it is estimated that over $3 billion in abuse settlements have been paid out by the Catholic Church. In the United States alone, 8 Catholic dioceses have gone bankrupt. These include Davenport, Fairbanks, Milwaukee, Portland, San Diego, Spokane, Tucson, and Wilmington. Worldwide, this number is much higher. Yet the Church doesn't change its ways. It just comes up with more creative methods of hiding its problem children. Unfortunately, Catholics the world over are not telling the Church to pound sand and taking their leave of this corrupt organization. They seem only too happy to keep paying money into the kitty, much of which goes toward hiding, defending, and paying the victims of these sex offender priests. But what about the Muslims? In the recent Boston Marathon bombing, we now know that the 2 brothers responsible acted out of their religious beliefs. In other words, Allah made them do it. Allah, or at least the belief in Allah, makes a lot of Muslims do horrible things. Anything from the 9/11 hijackings to honor killings, to the slaughter of innocents over drawings of Muhammad, to suicide bombers chasing after their 72 virgins. Islam is a serious, serious mess. I hate to break it to you people, but you don't get to run riot whenever you think someone has said something mean about your prophet, or doesn't take care of your book just right. I'm sorry, but Islamic violence worldwide is a massive problem. The number of cases of Muslims harming non-Muslims, or even other Muslims, on the basis of their beliefs is utterly mind-boggling. You could write a wholly Islamic version of the religious horror show and post 10 new stories an hour every day, every week, every month of the year, and still not come close to covering them all. So why is Islam so bad these days? Because Christianity, which was just as bad as Islam is today, has had the moderating effects of a secular society forced upon it for at least the last couple of decades, and it's been effectively neutered. There might be a few mad dogs running around out there, but it's nowhere near as bad as modern-day Islam. This is something that needs to change. But how about the various religious parents worldwide who deny their children medical care? There are sects in America today who routinely refuse to provide basic medical care for their children, instead preferring to rely on prayer. If God doesn't want their child to survive, then their child dies. There are several Christian sects that do this, from Christian Scientists to fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, and to a lesser degree, the Jehovah's Witnesses. For a long time, this was seen as mostly acceptable by a culture that was largely Christian in makeup. People give religion an automatic exemption from reality. You killed your kids? Murderer! Oh, you did it because of your religion? Well, that's okay then. Luckily, the times are changing, and more locales where these religions are big are passing laws specifically requiring that medical care is provided for minor children regardless of religion. There is no religious exemption. And parents that are letting their children wither away and die are being prosecuted for their crimes. Yes, I realize that the cases I have mentioned have been in the minority, that most theists are not crazed sociopaths out to gut the nearest heretic. I understand that these cases simply demonstrate the potential harm that a fanatical theist, one who actually follows the dictates of their religion, can cause. But it's not the only harm by any means. In fact, I'd argue that, especially in the modern world, religion is an inherent harm to the development, education, and maturation of children into productive members of society. When parents are teaching their children that an invisible man in the sky, who loves them but is all too willing to send them to a place of eternal torment, when there are people who believe that they're living in the end times and therefore don't have to treat our planet with respect, when you have people who are happy to treat other human beings like crap because they happen to believe in the wrong imaginary friend, that's harm, and there's no two ways about it. You have people who want to stop teaching credible science in public schools, all because they believe in a fairy tale told in an ancient book of Bronze Age mythology. You have people who want to go to war with other nations, not because we're defending ourselves against foreign aggression, but because the other guys believe in the wrong god. You have people who want to infringe on the rights and freedoms of American citizens and stop people from being treated equally because of their reading of fantasy stories. Faith is not a virtue. It's not something to be proud of. It is a defect in the rational human mind. Faith affects how you think and how you reason and how you act. It stops you from thinking rationally and critically about your beliefs because faith by its very definition cannot be challenged. Faith is fanatical, and fanaticism is inherently harmful. Isn't it about time we stopped allowing the endless religious horror show?